Hey guys, it's Taran and welcome to the On Track channel and to the 2022 race ratings for the Miami Grand Prix. So a very warm welcome to the Miami Race Ratings, a series taking a more chilled out look at the driver performances. As always, spoilers ahead if you've not seen or heard about the results from the past weekend. Also, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you enjoy and subscribe down below for more F1 content every week. Now with those two things out of the way, let's get into it. Now your winner for the inaugural Miami Grand Prix is of course Max Verstappen, as he collects his second consecutive win and closes the gap to Leclerc at the top of the standings to 19 points. And talking of Leclerc, he picked up second place and shared the podium with his teammate Carlos Sainz. Then behind them, Sergio Perez, who had to deal with some car troubles which we'll get into. Then in 5th and 6th comes the Mercedes duo, before Bottas, Ocon, Alex Albon in the Williams and Lance Stroll rounding out the top 10. Now for the race itself, very much a mixed bag. I think the start and the opening 10 or 15 laps were interesting, passes for the lead, midfield scraps, a few early pit stops, etc. But then we did get quite the dull patch in the middle. There were overtakes or attempted moves here and there, but generally not a ton going on. Until lap 41, I think it was, when Norris and Gasly came together, bringing out the safety car, which then gave us what I would say were possibly the best 10 laps of the season so far. You had 1st and 2nd close, 3rd and 4th battling, the two Mercedes having a tussle, plus countless other things going on lower down. I think maybe the only person still in the race not involved with something at the end was Latifi, and so for a rating, up until the last 10 laps it was probably 4, maybe 5, but with the ending and comparing to say Imola and Australia, I actually preferred it, and so I'm going to give it a 6.5. I actually don't think a 7 would be too wrong. I did quite enjoy watching the race, and looking back there was stuff happening throughout the field, plus safety car drama, so yeah, I think a pretty solid 6.5 is fair for me. Now on to teams, and starting with Haas and obviously their home race, I think they'd have liked a little bit more from it, and honestly the results were there to be had, they just didn't quite do what they needed to do. For the drivers, I'll start with Mick, who was honestly having a pretty good race, up a few spots at the start, then generally battling well with the cars around him and with his teammate also. Was running in the points right near the end, but then obviously had the crash with Vettel, which, while it didn't put him out of the race, it effectively ended it for him. I think before that incident he was on for probably a 7 or so, but that crash drops it down to a 4.5, just because while in general the race was pretty good, his collision came at such a crucial time and did ultimately cost him points. Then on to Magnussen, who had a fairly under-the-radar busy race, like his teammate gained places at the start and made a nice move to get past Lando Norris once the McLaren had pitted, and then for a while was right in that bunch of cars, including Mick, Vettel, Stroll and an Alpine I think. Pace-wise was fairly on par with his teammate, but generally got the sense that he wasn't quite doing as well, plus had a couple of late collisions with Stroll, one of which picked up a 5-second penalty, so I think for a rating it's probably a 4.5, actually maybe a 4. Race was looking maybe average, slightly below, and then you add in some collisions and penalties at the end, it just drops it that little bit more. So next up, McLaren, and not what they'd have liked to get from the weekend, and while I think, it wasn't as good as the last couple of races, there were some little things that ended up having big impacts for them. And one of those little things that had big consequences was Lando's pit stop, where just that extra couple of seconds put him out in the middle of a train where he got swallowed up and was sort of confined to the back of it in around 15th, 16th place, which will be so frustrating because until then he was pretty comfortably in 9th, not really under any threat from behind. And the pace from Lando was good. Like I said, I don't think that car was where it had been, but he was doing fairly well. But he then did have the collision with Gasly near the end, which I don't think is either driver's fault completely, but maybe I'd put a little bit more on Gasly. Still a disappointing way to end the Miami GP for Lando. Rating wise, it's going to be a 6. Until he stopped, he was running very well, and ultimately falling that far down wasn't really his fault. Then on to Ricciardo, who had a fairly quiet race, just sort of doing his own thing for the first half, was actually up to P8 at 1 point before stopping, but then when he did stop, came out in 17th and never really made any inroads into the cars ahead. Also picked up a 5-second penalty at the end for leaving the track and gaining an advantage, which then dropped him behind Tsunoda. So I think for Danny Ric, it's probably a 4.5, was doing okay, but then was really nowhere for that second stint, and after stopping for late softs, couldn't really capitalise on them. Next up, AlphaTauri, and a somewhat disappointing final result, I would say. I think generally throughout the weekend they were a little inconspicuous, but that isn't always the worst thing. For drivers, I'll start with Tsunoda, who started 9th and lost places at the start, before then pitting very early for hard tyres, complaining that the mediums were going off. and then from there was generally towards the back of the pack and not really making much of an impact. Then when we had the safety car, he swapped onto soft tyres and did make a bit of progress, helped out by the collisions between the Hasses and the Aston Martins. So rating wise though, it's still a 4. Not a great start, wasn't able to manage the tyres, then only really gained places at the end through incidents ahead even while on the softs. The saving grace for him from an even lower grade was that the actual pace during the race wasn't awful or anything. And then Gasly, who spent the majority of his race with Fernando Alonso. For the first part was fairly nicely in 7th, and I actually don't think was running outside the top 10 at any point before the collision with Alonso, which was definitely Alonso's fault, in my opinion at least. And sadly, Pierre felt the effects of that. Up until then, it was a pretty good drive. Just very solid pace and managing to hold off Alonso for almost 40 laps at that point. So on the whole for his rating, it'll be a 7. Was in net P7 when Alonso hit him and was likely on for a good couple of points. And as I've mentioned regarding the collision with Norris, nobody really to blame wholly, so I'm not going to take points off him for that. Then next up Aston Martin, who I think will be happy with the point that they picked up, but also maybe a little disappointed not to have both cars finish, as just maybe there would have been a little bit more that they could have squeaked out. For drivers, I'll start with Stroll, who, like his teammates, started from the pit lane after having fuel that was too low a temperature, which is certainly something that I'd never heard of before. But for the race, was towards the back for the first stint, still behind Latifi 15 laps in, but then did get past, and until the end, not really much happening with his race. But ultimately, when everything was going on ahead of him, he managed to really maximise the result and was elevated into 10th for a point with Alonso's second penalty. So I think considering it was a pit lane start, it's going to be a 7. Also pitted under the VSC, which would have helped a little, but still a point in Aston Martin is a good result. Then on to Vettel, and what was a really good race for him until that collision. Like Stroll, started from the pit lane and was behind Latifi for a bit, but after that did make some great moves. He passed Latifi into the slow Sector 2 section and then put a nice move on Magnussen as well. Was also generally with Stroll the whole race, so no real pace discrepancy. He did put under the safety car, which helped him out a fair bit, but was running in P12 and then was on the cusp of points before the collision with Schumacher, which, while not completely Seb's fault, at least according to the stewards, he probably could have done a little more to avoid it. No real blame though. So then rating wise, I think it'll have to be a 5. You know, the race was going fairly well, worthy of maybe a 7, but then the crash has to dock a couple of points. Next up Williams, and after the penalties at the end, not just 1 but 2 more points, which they'll be happy with. But also it is very much of a one-driver team at the moment, which we'll get into. So the first driver getting those 2 points, Alex Albon, and what was actually quite an under-the-radar performance. I don't really have too many notes other than he was on the back of Ricciardo during that opening stint, before stopping for hard tyres, which he then took to the end. Did jump a number of places under the safety car with other cars stopping, but importantly managed to sort of avoid the chaos going on around that area once the race got going again, and then obviously finished P9 with the penalties to Alonso. And I think as a performance, it's probably 7.5, could have been an 8, but he was helped out quite a bit by incidents for 5 cars ahead and then penalties for a 6th in Alonso, but it is still a great result. And then Latifi, and just a really bad race. There are 2 notes that I have for him which just really sum it up. First, that he was running in last place while being one of the few drivers who hadn't stopped, and then just before the safety car was 37 seconds off Tsunoda in front of him, which is just ridiculous to be honest. Did finish, but was easily so far last on pace, so rating wise, it's a 2.5. I was umming and ahhing between a 2.5 and a 3, but I think this is probably his worst pace deficit all year, which is really saying something. Then on to Alpine, and quite a lot going on with them. Some good performances and a couple of points, which is an improvement from the last race, so I guess that's good for them. With the drivers, I'll start with Ocon, who began the race pretty far back after not taking part in qualifying, slowly making his way through the field on his hard tyres, which, considering how tricky they were to begin the race for everyone on them, is quite good. And then really benefited from the safety car, which meant that after the restart he had soft tyres and was in P10. I will say though that maybe would have liked to have seen a bit more from him on those softs, considering everyone around him was on old hards. He didn't really make much progress, which is a little disappointing. So rating wise, it'll be a 7, still drove a good race and finished P8 after starting very far back, but was massively helped out by the safety car, hence it's not any higher. And then his teammate Alonso, who made a great start, up 4 places, made a little bit of contact with Hamilton but got away with it, but from there just spent the whole race in behind Gasly and wasn't really challenging too much until they came together on lap 39. Also wasn't helped by a slow stop and all that, but with the collision, I mean, he's just kind of stuck a nose in and got the 5-second penalty for it, which wouldn't have actually cost the team points if he hadn't got another penalty for leaving the track and gaining an advantage. So with both of those, I think it's going to be a 4.5 for Alonso. Ultimately, the race was kind of middling, maybe around a 5.5, 6, but then the 2 penalties just drag it down a bit. Next on to Alfa Romeo, and I think a result that they can be pleased with, but they won't be too happy with one car failing just a few laps in, but for a mid-table team, to pick up some points is always good. I'll start with Zhou because it's pretty quick, gets a not applicable rating. The car failed on lap 7, so I don't really think it's fair to judge his whole race on about 12% of the distance. Then on to Bottas, and what on the whole was a very good performance. The only real notes I have are him staying in 5th at the start, then being solidly 5th midway through, and still 5th all the way until the end, where he did make a slight mistake which let both Mercedes through, but ultimately I think Russell on the fresh tyres would have been getting past at some point there. So realistically, it's cost him a place which he may have lost anyway to Hamilton. So for a rating, I think it's going to be an 8. Had it not been for the safety car, it may well have finished in 5th place, but also had that small error which cost him points. On the whole though, to be comfortably 5th for virtually the whole race is a pretty impressive drive. Then on to Mercedes, and considering they were in I think 8th and 15th by the end of the first lap, to come away with 5th and 6th place is a good result for the team, and until the car is sorted, that's about as much as they can pick up. For drivers, I'll start with Lewis, and not the best of starts, sort of pinched himself on the first corner and then a little contact with Alonso allowed him past, but from there made moves back up to 6th pretty quickly, and on the hards was closing up to Valtteri ahead, but you can also maybe make the argument that he should have been doing that a little bit sooner. Then there were the safety car, and I have no idea why the team didn't pit him. There was like a 25-second gap to Ocon behind, which is a free stop without the safety car, so no idea why they didn't bring him in. Then after the restart, good little battle with Russell, which he was always going to lose given the tyres. So yeah, rating wise, I think it's a 7, overall a good drive, but nothing overly special I don't think. Then on to Russell, and instead of Mr. Saturday, could now be called Mr. Safety Car Pit Stop. Massively helped out obviously by the safety car, which probably gained him from a net 10th, 11th to 6th, 7th place. But I will say before that, I think he was actually driving really well and getting really good pace from those hard tyres. And if he stopped earlier for mediums and there wasn't traffic behind the Mercedes, I don't think he'd have been too far off of Hamilton by the end. Also, as mentioned, raced well with his teammate, kept it relatively clean, a little bit of technically off the track, but nothing too major. So I think for George, I'd actually give him a 7.5. The pace he was getting out of those hards from, say, lap 15 onwards was really good, and then obviously has finished P5 from P11, with of course help from the safety car. And then next up, Ferrari, a double podium, which is good, but that constructors lead is just getting smaller, down to 6 points, so they need to find ways to get the wins when Verstappen is finishing. For drivers, I'll start with Sainz, and I'm actually finding it a little tricky to rate. First off, lost out at the start, and would have to say was off Leclerc's pace for sure. Did have a slow stop, which didn't help, and had Perez not had his issues, I think he'd likely have finished 4th. But Perez did have issues, and Sainz managed to defend very well against him, especially when Checo had the fresh mediums at the end. So for a rating, I'm trying to decide between a 7.5 and an 8, but I think I'm going to go with that 8. Ultimately did hold off Perez, and I don't think the pace deficit to Leclerc was as big as it has been, plus he took home P3 and a podium in the end. Then Leclerc, and on the whole, a solid performance. P2 is a good result, but he would have liked that win. Held the lead at the start, but was passed on lap 9, did stick with Verstappen for a bit, but eventually dropped off at the end of the medium stint, which then carried over onto the hards, which is kind of becoming a reoccurring theme. Leclerc and Ferrari just having those tyres drop off more than the Red Bulls. What I will say though is that after the safety car, he really made something of it, got as close as he could to taking back the lead, so I'd say for a rating, I think it's probably an 8.5. Ahead of his teammate, but not able to take the win, still a very solid performance on the whole. And then finally Red Bull, who have all the momentum right now, back-to-back wins, just 6 points away in the Constructors, and definitely looking good moving forward from here. I'll start with Perez, who held position on lap 1, dropped back from Sainz just a little, but then was closing up until he had the sensor issue, I believe on lap 20, which didn't help him for the rest of the race. He was dropping back, but not really through any fault of his own. So to still keep up some good pace with problems is definitely a good performance on the whole. Plus, while he had the mediums, he was really challenging to get past Sainz, and had he done so, the grade would have been a little higher. Did of course outbrake himself a bit into turn 1. But it's still going to be an 8 for Checo. It's a little tricky to judge with that issue, but without that I do think he would have got 3rd, and it's still a very good drive on the whole. And then finally Max Verstappen, taking the win from 3rd place. Passed Sainz at the first corner, which he needed to do early, that meant he could pull away with Leclerc, and then once passed until the safety car was pretty comfortably out ahead, pulling like 6 or 7 seconds to the Ferrari. And then after the safety car managed to hold off Leclerc to take the win. There isn't really too much more to take away from his race. I think for that, it'll be a 9. I don't think it's the levels we've seen in the last 2 races from him and Leclerc, but it's still a very good controlling drive and ultimately takes home the win. So anyways, that rounds out the race ratings for the Miami Grand Prix. I do think on the whole I enjoyed it, and maybe the last 10 laps masked what was a bit of a dull race at times, but still I was happy enough with it, and it's got potential to get even better as well. Anyway, as mentioned before, do make sure to give the video a thumbs up if you've enjoyed, and subscribe for more F1 content, along with leaving your thoughts, feedback, ratings and suggestions down in the comments below. Until next time, take care.